So, what have we been talking about today? Well, energy infrastructure. How is our energy system going to pivot? How are we going to get to net zero 2050 in the United Kingdom and Europe? But what about the global south? What about India 2070, China 2060, the Middle East? Is the United Kingdom leading on the energy transition? And these are the questions that we need to be asking about. And we discussed around heating homes. We need to be thinking about how do we decarbonize, especially when you go for a remortgage. A couple of years' time, you're going to have your bank saying, what's your EPC rating so I can give you a discount on your mortgage? Well, if we need to do that, how do we need to do that? We need to accelerate and digitalize the energy system. So please, could I welcome on the stage?
Thank you so much, Navin, and also to the team here at Innovation Zero. I think that some of you might know, but my background really is the energy system and have chaired the government's energy data and digitalisation task forces. We've had a lot of interesting input from the energy sector over those two task forces, and I believe that some of the work that we've done and many of the people on this panel contributed to this has taken the energy sector on a journey. And that journey, maybe we could frame that the sector is probably about 20, that's generous, 20 to 30 years behind other sectors in terms of deep digitalization, changing processes, and being able to manage and, in many ways, enable the new system that we have. I will leave you with one thought before I hand over to this fantastic panel, and that is, currently the energy sector is run by 400 people in the UK, and some of you have heard this before, but they all know each other's golf handicap. We are now moving to a system where there will be 100 million actions and assets on this system and fundamentally change the way we need to do things. So digitalization is not a nice to have. It is not some form of technology gimmick. It is absolutely essential and at the core of how we run the system going forward. So I'm absolutely thrilled. We have a regulator, we have the United Nations looking at a much more global stage. We've got the energy system operator looking at how we operate the system. And I'd like to start with Greg, who's a former colleague of mine from the Energy Systems Catapult, who's been one of the very core brains behind the energy data and digitalization task forces. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, but also to cover off the issues. What do you think your top opportunity and your top barrier at this moment is? And then we'll come on to some other questions. Please also contribute on Slido to questions.
So thank you for having me, Lauren, for that very kind introduction. I don't know about the brains behind anything, but certainly the Scottish accent behind many things. So yeah, I'm Greg Johnston. I'm a senior consultant at Energy Systems Catapult until 5 o'clock today. I will be joining the ESO next week. But in my role at Catapult, kind of been supporting this mix of innovators coming through, doing interesting things, disrupting the market, but also supporting regulators, government around what are the big picture things that we need to change for the energy system moving forward. And I think going immediately to your questions, like in terms of an opportunity, we've spent the last few years really looking at the back end, like how does the ESO exchange data with other market participants? How do we get the foundational data layers between these market participants up and running so that we can move from 400 to 1 million or 100 million or maybe 1 billion? And right now we're kind of in this phase of the back end isn't sorted. It's not going to be for many years, but there's a sustaining momentum behind the DNOs. They have incentives behind them now. But we haven't really looked at the consumer yet. We haven't really thought about how it impacts you or you or you, and where the value drivers, and by value I don't mean financial, I mean how do you interact with the system? What do you want from the system? You want to be warm, you want the ability to stream Netflix, and you want a lot of other similar things. And we haven't really thought through what the market structures and how digitalization can really support that transition and make it available and something that you as consumers don't really need to think about, but gives you a lot of value. I think that's the main one for me. And what's stopping us from doing that? Well, there's for those of you familiar with the sector, there's things like REMA, kind of looking at market arrangements and stuff. That's some of the challenge. But foundationally, it's a people challenge. We do not have enough people in the energy sector with the skills, the capability, the vision to really look at beyond just solving a particular challenge in a moment in time and really look at what does 2035 look like and how can we realize that. So for me, it's a people challenge, it's a culture, because the technology, it's been there for 20, for 30 years. I'll pass over.
Thanks, Magnus. I mean, that's a really important point, isn't it? Because one of the fears that I have about our digitalization is that we are putting a digital layer on top of existing processes. And that, I think, is a fundamentally problematic outcome, because I think that's not necessarily going to be sustainable. But Magnus, you're head of AI for the ESO, and tell us how you look at the system going forward.
So, yeah, thank you for having me. I certainly agree with everything that Greg just said. Coming into the ESO in the last 12 months as the head of AI and automation and analytics, I do take a very AI-orientated view of digitalization. And so I kind of have this answer to the question a little bit on two levels. On the one level, the challenges that I face in my day-to-day job are the same challenges that any AI leader has anywhere. Access to centralized trustable data, better tools, better capabilities, but, and this comes to your point, adoption. We can build as much AI as we like, but if we can't get it into the hands of end users and have those end users actually use that new intelligence that we're generating, then we haven't actually delivered any value. And what I can see is, there's this problem I face in my day-to-day job right now, which is getting that collaboration across different business units. So instead of just inserting digital tools within pre-existing linear processes, that we're looking more at a platform model. And that's going to fundamentally mean transformation of a lot of processes that have been laid down decades ago. But we've got to reach beyond that and have that collaboration and the transformation go across the entire industry sector. And that means I see this both a micro and a macro problem happening at once. There are tools that we need to deliver, and we need to deliver them very quickly. But then we need to have this whole energy vision of how that intelligence is going to be embedded in tools and how those tools are going to be put into the hands of end users. If our control room are looking at data about what's going to happen in the next 24 hours, everybody else in the industry should be looking at exactly the same thing, in my opinion. And we should be collaborating to develop those tools. But it even goes beyond those, the industry participants. It goes all the way through to end users and the household. So a lot of challenges at a micro level, the usual AI digitization things, but also this macro UX challenge, both at an industry and at a whole of country level.
Yeah, I mean, it is about business practice, not really just digitalization and AI, but we are the enablers. And Dario, when you look at across Europe and also internationally, what do you see both the greatest challenges are, but where do you see leadership and things moving at the right level of acceleration?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, first of all, for having me here. Indeed, you might be asking why the United Nations is getting involved in this thing. Well, actually, what we do is we help member states drive the energy transition, and digitalization is a very important part for the energy transition. But remember one thing, 600 million people in Africa don't have access to energy. Yeah. So here, we are in the UK, we're blessed with a legacy infrastructure and a very developed economic system. For many countries, is actually having having access to energy. Digitalization for them is not about putting the layer on top of the existing processes. It's actually a developing opportunity for them. Like the mobile telephones were for mobile banking in Africa. They jump-started, a leapfrog, exactly, the whole innovation scale. So a couple of years ago, we did a survey asking people across all of the stakeholders, because we work with all the stakeholders around these issues, what are the main challenges from your perspective around digitalization, and what are the benefits? And first issue that came up was the lack of awareness of benefits of digitalization. You might think, the general public, 50% of the general public that was polled, they would say, I don't know what is in for me, exactly what you just said before. What is in for me? I know, they kind of fear that being controlled, and you would expect that. But 42% of the respondents from the governments said, we don't know what's the benefit of digitalization. And if you are absolutely right when you say you need to bring the industry together, you need to bring everybody together, governments. So one of our principal roles is to inform, educate, disseminate, bring the different aspects of the governments together to understand what the role of digitalization is. Mm-hmm. That is a great opportunity. Think about just one issue, electrification of transport. So you need to bring around-side housing authorities, need to bring urban planning authorities, the power generation, the regulators and Ministry of Energies, the city councils, the central government, all of them together to understand what's the impact of electrifying transport on and digitalizing that electrification of that system on the overall system. So that's what we do. And you asked me another question, because I think you say, who's leading? Obviously, the most developed countries, the countries that have innate capacities in this space, you would be thinking are leading. But the US, for example, is a laggard in this principle. Why? Because they have insulated electric line, grid networks. Think about Texas and think about the rest of the US. In certain aspects, they are very much more advanced, and in others are less. Obviously, the developed world is very much advanced. When it comes to digitalization, you need to look at in which area of the energy value chain you're looking at. And here you have different actors and different countries which are taking the lead, whether you're looking at power generation, whether you're looking at management of consumption or grid and transmission.
Thank you so much. And maybe extending Dario's point into beyond policy and departments, but into regulation. It's wonderful to have Liam here. And I just did want to give a bit of a call out to Ofgem, because they have really skilled up when it comes to digitalization. And I think it was one of the most, the sort of forward-thinking investing in digitalization. But Liam, you and I and a lot of the people in this room have actually worked together on the data and digitalization task forces. Do you think that the networks, that the system has actually moved fast enough? And what do you think the challenges are for us to actually realize the dream of those task force recommendations?
Yeah, thank you, Laura, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for waiting for your lunch or for having it early. I think the opportunity is massive in digitalization for consumers in particular. And we've tried to focus in Ofgem over the last 4 or 5 years on the findings of the task force and driving efficiencies across the regulated entities. So trying to make sure some of those cost benefits of digitalization actually flow down through to consumers. I think, as Greg touched on earlier, the bit we maybe haven't tackled quite as strongly yet is the actual consumer direct interaction with digitalization. But we are moving in that direction, so we'll have a consultation out at the end of June on consumers providing consent to their data to be shared within the energy system. But if I look at where we're at before the task force in 2018, it's night and day in Ofgem. We didn't have a dedicated digitalization team. We're now 10 people strong. We have massive internal capabilities, and we can actually actively engage with the sector on not just what is the policy framework, but what are the technical solutions that need to be delivered by the sector to achieve that kind of more decentralized vision of the world. So I think we have seen change. I think a lot of it has been subsurface till now. It's companies making investments in data governance, in enterprise architecture, and we'll start to see more of the consumer interacting processes come forward over the next 3 to 5 years, I would expect.
Just starting with you again, Liam, when we start to look at, let's say, the next price control for networks, the expectation is quite deep in terms of data sharing, data infrastructure, etc. Do you think that they really understand the significant need for their operations? I think sometimes the sector thinks that digitalization is some crazy idea that Laura and her mates came up with, rather than actually an intrinsic part of how they need to manage the system. And I just come back to this South Australian example where they are now at 70 to 100% renewables on their system and have had to totally and utterly change their business models. I mean, how far do you think we've got? Where do we need to go to? And what would be useful for advocates in this room to push?
Sure. So I think that culture change is happening. It's probably not happening quite at the pace we would have liked to see over the Rio 2 period. So for us in Rio 3, it's an opportunity for the regulated networks, the transmission networks, the gas networks, to really invest in those foundational bits of digital infrastructure internally and prepare themselves to interact with a world that, as you say, is only going to get more complex. So the big investment we're asking people for in Rio 3 really is to be ready to connect to what we call a data sharing infrastructure, which comes out of the Energy Digitalisation Taskforce's recommendation of a digital spine. So the ESO is pushing that work forward, and we are going to require network companies to connect to that as part of Rio 3. And we think that will bring greater visibility to those companies of the struggles each other company is having. So maybe the collaboration isn't quite where we need it to be in the sector, but the investments are getting there.
And Dario, I'm coming back to your point about different parts of the world actually leapfrogging. I was doing some work in India, and they were saying to me, well, you know, we never put in fixed line telephones, so what on earth would we be doing putting in this old grid structure? When you look at what's happening, do you see that the leapfrogging, that in some ways system design is much, much more technology focused than in some ways heavy infrastructure focused? And what examples do you think we can learn from?
Yeah. Yeah, I would say, again, I think I'll need to go back to the point or, you know, the whole energy value chain, because really you need a huge infrastructure to produce energy. You know, it's the comparison with the telecommunication sector goes to a certain extent. It's valid up to a certain extent. I think you need, in many of these countries, it's about bringing, you know, first of all, you know, producing energy and then delivering that energy. And so you're looking at decentralized energy systems.
Yeah.
That's the first bit. The second bit is, once you have reached a certain level of energy provision, then you want to go above the minimum energy access that you need. And if you start looking at the industrial use of energy, then you would be looking at centralized systems. How do you combine a centralized energy system with a decentralized energy system? And how are you going to... That's the first hurdle that many countries find. Especially in Africa or developing markets, that's one of the first one. How do you manage that, you know, both systems at the same time? And that's where digitalization comes in handy to work on that. And that's where they can leapfrog, you know, the old economies that would say that they have a heavily centralized system on which you are just adding a lot of points. So it's a different construction from a system perspective, because you're going from many separate islands, putting them together. Oh, wow. I didn't mean that.
Sorry, everyone.
And to a system which instead ours, where you have a network and you're just adding points of entry into that network. And you're creating a host of lot of different challenges on that. If I may, one point that I've been on the skills thing, one interesting point is every time that we talk about digital, maybe not here, but elsewhere, is you have the energy specialists, the energy engineers. They say, oh, this is digital. This is for people, PC people. And they're separate communities, and they don't speak to each other. And that one of the first things is to bring them together, actually speak and make sure that they understand, because otherwise you won't be able to use digitalization in energy.
So it's very funny because Greg and I experienced this where, one of our recommendations on the Digitalisation Taskforce is about culture.
Yeah.
And when you've got fabulous engineers and economists who have got 25-year assets, they meet a digital native and the digital native says, well, I need 200 grand, I don't know how long it's going to go for, I'm not really sure what the end result will be, but we'll learn a lot on the way. The engineer starts to hyperventilate because this isn't the world in which they live.
Yeah.
And that sort of cultural issue on how investments are made, etc. And maybe I come to you, Magnus, because you've just arrived at the ESO. And I wonder what sort of challenges and sort of cultural, you can spill the beans. Nobody will say anything to Finton, okay? No, but what sort of cultural changes do you feel that you have in terms of understanding the real opportunities here? Or are you just a layer on top of existing engineering?
So I think that the ESO in its role of both planning the network and balancing the system is facing an exponential level of complexity from the number of decisions and the data points, etc. And on the, first of all, we cannot scale an analog workforce to stay in sync with the challenge that we have. We have to adopt digital tools in order to add hyper productivity to the people that we already have and the people that we're bringing in. But yes, people are afraid, and as I said, I look at this very much from the point of view of AI, and you say AI, and half the people run out of the room. And so there is a huge challenge to, first of all, get people comfortable with the technology and understand what it is that we're talking about, and that it doesn't necessarily have to be something to be feared. And one of the things that I spend a lot of time talking about internally is that AI does not mean job replacement. That's not what it's about. And I'm originally an econometrician, and I take a very economic approach to AI and ensuring that there's a business case behind every project that we're doing. And the business case is never about removing people from a business process, because the AI is probably more expensive than the few people that you would get out. It's absolutely about introducing productivity. I talk a lot about people having 3 job descriptions. One is the job description that they actually answered. Second bucket is the things that they actually do day in, day out. And 3 is the stuff that they would love to get to because they know that if they could do it, it would really add value to their organization. But they never get to number 3 because they're stuck at number 2. And number 2 is usually repetitive. And if it's repetitive, it's predictable. And if it's predictable, I can add a digital tool to take it off their desk and free them up to go and do those innovative, strategic things that are going to move it all forward. But I can say that. It doesn't change minds straight away. I've got to have to be saying it again and again for the rest of my career at the ESO, I suspect. And the other one is starting off very small and just growing out, rather than scaring everyone with a big bang.
So it's show, not tell.
Yeah.
Which is quite important.
Absolutely.
Greg, you talked about customers, which I think is really interesting, and maybe Magnus wants to comment on this as well. I think I said at the thing earlier this morning is it's very interesting how this sector is totally obsessed with trying to understand the weather. And it spends its whole life trying to predict the weather. And the weather doesn't take price signals. It doesn't follow legislation. Doesn't enter markets. However, customers are really rather boring because we all get up at the same time. We do all of this. And one of the things that absolutely shocked me when I came into the sector, having been involved also in the food sector, is how Tesco can predict that you're pregnant before you know it yourself because of the analytics, whereas the energy sector compartmentalizes us into 6 archetypes only, right? How do we really start to understand, to unlock this flexibility by a totally different level of customer insight? And your very important point about consent.
Yeah. So for me, I think it's, to that point about 6 archetypes, how many people are sat in front of us? Can you group yourself into 6 different slots? Probably not, even with the best will in the world. So we have an intrinsic problem that most of the organizations in the sector who are doing all the interesting digitalization, maybe Octopus accepted, are what I would describe at the back end. You're not consumer facing, broadly. And that means that you go down a certain path where you've had a business model for many decades that does not require you to think about the end user other than, is there energy at the end point or not? I don't really care how it's being used at the end point, but now now it's making a difference because, just for a show of hands, how many people have an EV that are sat in front of us? Okay, how many of you have a heat pump? Great, that's actually more than I thought it would be. Solar panels? Right, how many of those devices do you think the ESO knows about? Probably not too many, right? And I think that's one of the core challenges that we have, that the energy system for a very long time has not really cared what happens with the energy at the end of the day. Now, some of the big things like National Rail, yes, they'll need to work out how to do that quite intricately, big I&C sites. But given that we're now moving from that 400 to 100 million, it becomes a whole lot more important. There is that kind of flexibility side of things, that is one element of it, but fundamentally, at the end of the day, and I always, despite working in digital, and I kind of not quite describe myself as digitally native, but a lot of the focus is on, okay, we can improve processes or we can really rip up and do something just a little bit differently. But fundamentally, the energy system serves one purpose, is humans get energy at the end of the day to do stuff that they want to do. That's all everything else, markets, flexibility, different business models, is by the by. It's monkeys with spreadsheets. That we're just messing around with numbers. Fundamentally, all we need is a system that gets energy from A to B and provides the basic need that we all have. And now, the way the energy system is going, with the proliferation of devices that some of you own, the way that energy is generated has changed. And because it has changed and is now more in the consumer's hands, that changes the dynamic for the system. And now they are beginning to care what you do. They're beginning to care when you're going to buy solar panels or when you're going to buy a heat pump. And that dynamic hasn't really been reflected in how the energy system kind of treats you as consumers. And I think the biggest challenge is that kind of cultural shift we talked about in Taskforce of, you really just need to understand what people need and then how you can facilitate that. And as a kind of tangential point, a lot of the energy sector is a great facilitator for the rest of the economy to be built upon. And I think maybe taking that attitude of, the rest of the system doesn't really need to care what we're doing. We just need to get it right and allow them to come in and take what they need from us. And that attitude is starting to change. And I think that's kind of where we need to go.
Fantastic. Please do use Slido and give us some questions that I should be asking. But so Magnus, when you start to look at the task ahead and the digital and the AI applications, one of the things, again, and I really do love the energy sector, I promise you, but we don't seem to learn from other sectors. And there is a huge amount, whether that be the logistics sector, whether it be the massive amount of digitalization in fast-moving consumer goods sector, Amazon, etc. How do we start to understand system design from other sectors?
Oh, that's an interesting question about system design. I was just going to touch on one point about not being consumer focused and our need to better understand how consumers are behaving in reaction to the weather, without sort of saying we're coming after your smart meter data. Just like any of the engineers that are within ESO or within the industry, there's a long-term journey to build trust on that front. In terms of planning and learning from other sectors, I think I would challenge it just a little bit that we don't learn from other sectors. I think that, as you said in your introduction, we are a bit behind. And I think that lack of progress is more just because the necessity hasn't been there until relatively recently. But as you would know, with the new structure of ESO becoming the national energy system operator and putting a lot more focus into strategic energy planning and regional energy planning, again, we've got this micro and macro problem. We're looking at how do we get the data? How do we get trusted data centralized so that our data scientists are able to access it and build smart and relevant models and put digital tools into the hands of those planners. But at the same time, I think that those planners are looking across those industries like logistics, everything from chip design. I've had someone talking about the way the microchip industry uses generative AI to design microchips. And the hypothesis was, well, an entire energy system is actually the same problem, just blown up at a massive level, which was a really interesting idea, and because it has a lot of the same constraints to do with heat and networks. So I think that there is a lot of that learning going on. It's probably just hidden because of the lack of progress that we've experienced. If we are, I won't say 30 years behind, but we're not as far as advanced as some industries for sure. As we run to catch up, and we are running and we are catching up, I think that learning and not repeating the mistakes that others have made will become more evident.
I think that's a huge opportunity. Dario, you looking at this from a global point of view, when you start to look, and this might be a question that's also come through on Slido, that I'll extend it to everybody, but when you start to look at digital capabilities and digital access and energy, when you're looking at, in some ways, Global South, there is a huge opportunity to, in some ways, conflate these as one service. And how do we look at, in some ways, equity when it comes to energy access, but digital access too? I mean, you talk about Africa, but everybody in Africa is trading on their mobile phones. It is absolutely phenomenal, the penetration, isn't it?
You're absolutely true. I think digitalization can be a great equality tool to increase equality, but as well can be an inequality tool that drives inequality, because you need to be prepared to use those tools. And so the reason is, as long as those tools, those digital tools, are easy to be used by consumers, then it's a great equalizer, if you allow me this perspective. Yes. If they become complex, then actually they create inequality. Take an example. Take the population segments in the developed world. Take the elder people, for example. In our world, they are lost because they don't have those digital skills, and actually the digital world is creating for them a whole new dimension and a whole lot more complex to be used. They used to go and pay their bill at the bank or at the post office, get it in the post, pay with that, and now, you have to, if they don't want to be your direct debit on your bank accounts, then it creates a whole lot of issues. So it depends on how you use technology. It's a great thing. It only depends on how you actually use it.
Yeah, but isn't it also how it's designed? I mean, my mother's on my 95-year-old mother is on my Twitter feed, and sometimes there's some very strange tweets that come out, and people say, "Laura, are you drunk?" But anyway, it's just her not quite understanding how to tweet. However, I think it's also about how we design things as well.
Right, exactly.
And it shouldn't be. I mean, this is one of the big problems. I don't know how many of you are digital geeks in this audience, but to be frank, a little bit like energy geeks, sometimes we're not really understanding how to design things around real human beings.
Exactly.
And that is a very important part. And I think I've said this before, but we do try and turn customers into energy, so heating engineers and electricity engineers, when we should be designing our systems to cater for their needs, not ours.
And here, the emerging markets have a great advantage because you need to design from scratch.
Exactly.
As opposed to us, that you need to bolt on an existing infrastructure and an existing, system and processes and procedures. And we would need to re-engineer all of them from scratch, as opposed to just adding, as Magnus just said that before. But that's what we try to tell the governments. But it's not always easy. It takes, it takes an open mentality for that, and it implies in our societies implies taking a risk.
Absolutely.
Where there's nothing, you don't take any risk. Anything is better than zero. But in our societies, you actually, stakeholders, governments, administration, businesses, they take a risk in doing that. That's where the importance of showing what the opportunity is behind that risk and why taking that risk is valid.
So I'm going to pose to Liam a question that's come through here, but has been a sort of passion of mine, and I think Greg's as well, and other people. And that is that we're looking at an energy system that becomes digitalized. That all sounds fantastic until we find that the comms network and the comms infrastructure isn't as robust and has a different level of resilience to that of the energy system. And our fantastic 30, 40-year-old system of government and regulation, we've got these fabulous silos. So how do we start to understand that, in my view, energy and comms is one infrastructure, not two? How do we look to build integrated system design across regulation and across systems things?
Yeah, so it's a very good question. I think we're only going to see all utilities become more interlinked, and it's great to have seen some innovative projects in this space like Credo, looking at actually kind of what are the cascading impacts of failures in the energy system, in the water system, or within the telecom system. So for me, half of it is a data sharing problem. It's about making sure those organizations that operate the monopoly networks can actually exchange the right information with each other to understand the operation of their relative networks and the interdependencies they have on each other. And we're trying to encourage that as a regulator through things like the data sharing infrastructure. From a regulatory perspective, I think, yes, we are a little bit hindered by the way our legislation is structured that gives us our powers, but I think the net zero duty on Ofgem gives us the capabilities to go beyond our sector and really look at those impacts. But, we do a lot of engagement with the UK regulators network, and we think that's going to be a really important forum moving forward to talk about digital issues and digital interconnectivity, and we're going to continue to use that. I think we'll need more, and we'll need government to support us in that. But certainly, we're trying to make it operational as it stands.
Fantastic. Now, we've got some brilliant questions from people, and maybe what I'd ask each of you to do is to answer some of these questions, but then also sum up with where would you like us to be in 5 years' time? What do I not have to rant about, or you rant about within your organizations, or to the government, or to the regulator? Yeah. But we've got a couple of questions around are we really capable of looking at the vehicle to grid, the truly flexible system design, and what do we need to do to put in place the measures that really address that? Because when we look at this, the number of EVs on the system by 2035 will be the equivalent of 3 nuclear power stations. So how are we going to turn these assets into, or these burdens into assets? Greg, if I start with you, but do cover where would you like to feel that you, through your role, have driven something forward by the next 5 years?
Great.
Or 2 years?
Or 2 years, yeah. So for me, the V to G point, it's about understanding consumer behavior. So we don't have 6 archetypes. We have, AWS is 100,000 or whatever it was you were saying earlier.
Yeah.
If we understand how consumers are using those devices, if they're happy for that information to be parsed through to us around that consumer consent point, then we can start making more intelligent decisions. People can start operationalizing, okay, we can start predicting how these things are going to impact, where they're going to be physically, and how that can support grid infrastructure, flexibility services, all those sorts of things. So again, that kind of takes me back through to the point around like where I'd like to see progress is our ability to scalably share data. And I think the main thing that I've been working on for the last few years is really like, how do we solve that challenge? For any of you that work with companies that try and share information with each other, you often end up banging your head against a wall for 7 months. Their lawyers speak to your lawyers, they speak to someone else, and eventually you get a bit of data and you go, that's not what I wanted. And then you go through the same cycle again. And there's a great bit of work that ESO and Ofgem are supporting on that data sharing infrastructure that Liam mentioned. And I think that might crack it. And if that does, then I won't have to moan about that, and I'll probably continue to moan about the consumer things until that's sorted. So that's me.
We're going to watch with interest, but I think Liam might have some very positive things to be saying about that. So Magnus, when you start to look at the new challenge that the ESO has, a lot of us have been talking about it being digital first, AI driven. How far do you think we've come in that sense, and what do you think is needed in terms of delivering those public interest digital assets that the Taskforce and other people have been talking about?
So as I said before, I think there has been significant progress that may not be as visible to the outside as we would like it to be. No data scientist is, if you ask the question of where are we in comparison to where we would like to be, nobody's where they want to be. I have a picture in my mind of where I would like us to be, and we're not there, but if we were there, I would have a different picture in my mind. Sorry.
No, we're just being,
oh.
my bad chairing, but just...
No problem. If I just go straight to what that vision looks like, of where I think we should be aiming to get to in 5 years. As I said, I think in the very first question, I am really passionate about this idea of broad industry-wide collaboration. Not just building tools to serve the purpose of the ESO, but if I can build that tool, I should be able to put that in the hands of any of the industry participants so that they're not waiting to get a surprise phone call from our control room. They're actually anticipating and proactively reacting to the same data and tools that we're reacting to.
Yeah. Fantastic. Dario.
Very short.
Your dream.
My dream. Half of those 600 million people in 5 years' time have access to secure, reliable, and sustainable energy, thanks to digitalization as well.
I like that a lot.
That's like creating
this
one
is
UK, connecting 1 UK a year. We can do it.
Yeah.
It's huge and fantastic. Liam, your vision for regulation going forward for digitalisation?
Sure. So for me, what I really want to achieve in the sector is that consumers can start to trust the sector again after a very difficult time and understand the value their data holds to them, and not just to an energy system that has traditionally treated them as a meter number. So I really just want to make sure that consumers understand that they can engage with the sector, look at new products and services, and start to benefit from the change we're all going through.
Thank you all very much. I hope you feel that the energy sector is moving into the 21st century. Thank you for a fabulous panel, and very good to chair this today.
And thank
you.